I used to think stories like mine only ever happened to other people. The heads on the evening news, the fleeting faces in survival documentaries, the ones who turned tragedy into something triumphant by the time the credits rolled. Those stories, I thought, belonged to the sort of people who'd always expected to be tested by life. Adventurers, warriors, those built from a hardier material than the rest of us. But if there's one thing I now know for sure, it's this: the impossible is never picky. It lands sudden and absolute in the lap of anyone, anywhere, ripping your life out by the roots and demanding to see what you're really made of. What I survived didn't come as a headline. It built silently in cracks and shadows until one day, impossible became my only option. The day that divided my life into before and after began like any other. I got up, shuffled to the kitchen, started the coffee, stared out at the drizzle painting pale streaks on the window. I had a list of small, ordinary plans for work, for groceries, a dinner to thaw in the fridge. I didn't know I had less than 12 hours left in my old life. At 8:13 a.m., my world began to unravel. First, a call from the hospital. My younger brother, always the wild one, had been in a car crash. Non-life threatening, the nurse said quickly, but there was an edge to her words that clung in my chest. I raced across town on autopilot, corridors alive with the hum of suffering, those antiseptic smells that never leave after you notice them once. When I saw him, tubes, bruises, lines of pain scored into his face, something fundamental inside me shifted. The impossible wasn't just about what happened to him, it was about what would happen to me, to our family, if he couldn't come home. For the first time, all the routines and minor grievances of my life seemed like small leaves floating on a vast, uncaring sea. Days blurred. My brother's recovery was slow, and as we hovered at the edge of hope and despair, I became the anchor, the one who held our mother through her silent crying, who mediated the doctor's technical answers into sentences our father could hear, who fielded calls from relatives who suddenly remembered our number. That first week, I didn't sleep more than a handful of hours. I caught myself resenting the hospital staff for their efficiency, envying their practiced indifference, wishing for their ability to step in and out of suffering and leave it at the door. But I couldn't leave it. I let it carve something deep and hollow inside, a valley, a place where all my certainties ran dry. When people talk about resilience, they imagine a heroic pushback, strength rising to meet disaster. That's not what it felt like. Surviving, at least at first, was just waiting out the night, shaking with exhaustion, learning to accept that sometimes the bravest thing you do is simply to endure, not knowing if things will ever be okay again. When my brother finally stirred, groggy but alive, I believed we'd made it through, but the impossible was more persistent than I ever imagined. Bills piled up. My job, patient at first, started asking if I could work remote between doctor's appointments. I did at odd hours, laptop balanced on hospital tray tables, my responses measured so nobody sensed how frayed I was becoming. Friends dropped off casseroles, then quietly dropped out of sight. My partner, overwhelmed by my constant anxiety, gently suggested maybe it was time he got some space. Pain arrived in layers, the sharp panic of medical emergencies, the dull throb of loneliness, the slow bleed worry that life might not ever feel safe or ordered again. The person I'd been, a fixer, a doer, someone who had answers, began to disappear. Sometimes I would stand in the bathroom with the water running and not even recognize my own face in the mirror, eyes haunted, back hunched by grief I didn't have words for. And yet, every day I showed up, not out of courage, but because there was no other choice. I learned that the human heart is elastic, extending beyond what you thought possible, stretching to contain fear, heartbreak, and somehow hope. The moment of real transformation didn't come when my brother was released from the hospital. It didn't come when we finally spoke our first words about what the accident had cost us, his career, my sense of control. It came quietly months later, the day I realized I'd survived something impossible and could not go back to the way I was before. One night, unable to sleep, I sat at the window and watched the sky lighten. I heard the birds, felt the hush before the city woke. I acknowledged finally my survival, not as a victory march, but as a map of scars, places where I'd been remade by pain. Surviving the impossible had taught me that life is not about evading disaster, but about finding the grace to persist inside it. It's about discovering what's left behind when everything you thought you needed is stripped away. That morning, still wrapped in the unfinished rawness of everything we'd endured, I felt something shift, like the tiniest flame in the dark, fragile but warm. But it was in the quiet aftermath, when I stopped trying to bounce back, that real transformation began. With my brother back at my apartment and my parents' world still trembling, I learned to count victories differently. A good day was a gentle day, one where everyone made it through without tears, where the phone didn't ring with more bad news, where a simple meal shared at the kitchen table felt like a prayer. I didn't want triumph. I didn't want people to call me brave or resilient or strong. I wanted only to find a way to keep moving, to build something gentle atop the ruins of what my life had been. I learned to be present, to let go of the control I'd clung to for so long, to stop fighting what was out of my hands. I called old friends and for the first time spoke honestly. I'm not okay, I confessed. At first, it scared people off. Some avoided me, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. People have a script for tragedy, but not for the slow grind of impossible healing. Others surprised me. I reconnected with an old college roommate who understood loss in ways only another survivor does. She listened, didn't judge, didn't offer platitudes. She simply let me speak and sat with my silence. I learned there is a difference between the people who need you to be okay for themselves and those who can stand with you when you aren't okay at all. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but cumulative. I became softer, though nothing about what we'd survived was easy. I started to notice the lives and stories flickering around me. The nurse who worked double shifts but always found time for a smile. The elderly man who sat each morning on my bus stop bench and fed pigeons with a care that made the world feel less sharp. I witnessed ordinary gifts, small acts of kindness, the offer of a seat, the steadying hand on a stranger's arm, the fabric of humanity, worn but never broken. My brother moved slowly through recovery. There were days he raged against pain, against losses that couldn't be named, but I watched him grow, watched us both turn stubbornness into courage, 1 hour at a time. Some wounds didn't heal, not the way hope had promised. I put in my notice the same week. It was reckless, but I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I needed to make what I'd learned useful, to stop pretending life is defined by earning power or how many hours you can grind through exhaustion. The old metrics, deadlines, sales goals, endless meetings felt hollow and alien. Something changed in you, my boss said, trying to sound supportive, hiding her fear that I was no longer obsessed with productivity. But new strengths coalesced in their place: patience, empathy, something like wisdom. We laughed sometimes. Laughing, we discovered, is a muscle. If you use it every day, it comes back. My job never quite fit again. So I started volunteering at the rehab center where my brother had endured months of therapy. There, I found a room full of stories, unvarnished, brutal, and astonishingly beautiful. People who had survived cancer, car wrecks, overdoses, betrayals, and worse. Some wanted to talk, some needed only to sit in quiet company. I never asked what brought anyone there. Their presence was explanation enough. My survival gave me a language of silence, a comfort I could offer simply by listening. It was the first time I ever felt my pain knot and dissolve into purpose. Transformation was a slow, recursive thing, never a straight line, never the stuff of inspiration posters. I slipped, doubted, panicked, and sometimes ran out of hope entirely. But every time, I found myself returning, seeking connection. I realized it's not about moving past the impossible, but weaving it into your new identity, letting it become part of you without letting it define all you are. One evening in late spring, I sat outside with my brother and listened to the city wind down. We shared stories, not about the accident or the hospital, but about hopes for the future. He spoke tentatively about wanting to travel, about learning to forgive his body for what it couldn't do. I told him how afraid I still was, how I sometimes woke up sweating, expecting the phone to ring with bad news. We promised each other to keep speaking the truth, to stay soft where the world urged us to harden, to let our scars be reminders not just of what we survived, but of how much beauty remained possible. Through surviving the impossible, I had been remade. The most astonishing lesson wasn't that I came through tragedy, but that I discovered in its shadow a new gratitude, a hunger for life's smallest offerings. I learned how to be tender with myself, how to accept help, how to both grieve and keep going, even when hope seemed out of reach. That is what survival taught me, that every life can be remade, one honest day at a time. As the months layered over the wreckage, I kept waiting for something to announce that the impossible was over. I wanted a signal that this was behind me, a line drawn in the sand separating suffering from normalcy. But the truth is, no such banner ever unfurled. Impossible changes you in ways you don't expect, not by erasing pain, but by making you larger inside it. I started to talk openly with people I trusted about the strange aftermath of survival, the guilt for having made it through, the resentment at being called inspirational, the quiet longing for my former, smaller problems. One unexpected lesson came through my brother's journey. His body wasn't the same, and neither was his spirit. We both discovered that surviving is a kind of negotiation. Every day you trade parts of who you were for the raw possibility of who you might yet become. Some mornings he cursed his scars and the steady ache that never left. Other days he marveled at how a single sunrise could feel like a second chance. Our relationship changed. Forced honesty stripped away old resentments, and we learned how to need one another without shame. My own sense of family expanded from duty and performance to real mutual reliance. I began journaling, first as therapy, then as record, and finally as a kind of prayer. I wrote about pain, of course, but also about the moments that kept me alive. A stranger's kindness at the pharmacy, the morning I found my brother asleep with his hand resting on the family dog. The way a song on the radio could catch my chest and wring tears out of tired laughter. I put everything down, grief, jealousy, exhaustion, gratitude, so that later I could look back and see how far we'd come when forward progress felt impossibly slow. The practice didn't make suffering disappear, but it made meaning visible against the ordinary blur of days. At the rehab center, my viewpoint widened. The stories of survival were as different as fingerprints, each unique, each shaped by distinct loss and adaptation. Some people had survived violence, others addiction, still others the loss of a child or the disappearance of a spouse. The variety was staggering, but what we shared was the unspoken language of those who have been rearranged by life. There was a woman, Maggie, who lost both legs in a fire and who taught me that mourning what you've lost is not weakness, but hygiene. You have to process the dirt and the ashes just as you celebrate survival. There was Dan, a stroke survivor, who demonstrated how a day spent relearning how to button a shirt could be as victorious as a marathon. My world, formerly driven by achievement and outward success, became focused on how well I listened, how much I understood the language of fear, hope, and disappointment. I became a collector of small victories, the smile of someone who managed another step down the hallway, the comfort we provided just by sitting together. The relief that came from admitting today is hard without needing advice or bright side cliches in return. I learned how to hold someone else's pain without picking it up as my own and how to let them do the same for me. Life outside of survival, I found, is gentler and more surprising when you stop assuming you know its terms. I started teaching free workshops for caregivers and survivors, a simple circle, word of mouth, where we could gather and talk, sometimes cry, often laugh at absurdities the world doesn't see. Here I learned the distinction between moving on and moving with. My story was no longer one of brokenness, but of accommodation, evolution, and fierce-rooted joy. The group became a collection of companions in the vast process of becoming, a place where stories mingled, buoyed by the honesty that comes from those who no longer need to pretend. For a long time, I shrank from public labels. I didn't want to be defined solely by what I had survived or to be used as a lesson for others. But the more I opened up, the more people contacted me, some quietly, painfully writing, "I thought I was the only one." I realized at last that my vulnerability was a kind of hospitality, a door I could hold open. For those who might wander in, scared and uncertain, desperate for proof that they too could keep living after the unthinkable. The final dimension of my transformation was the resolve to create rather than only endure. I returned to an old hobby, Gardening. My small balcony became a kingdom of green. Each seed pressed into dirt, each shoot cradled through sun and rain, felt like a hopeful wager against the impossible. Gardening taught me patience anew, that life unfolds at its own pace, that beauty grows beside loss, and that tending to small things can build a bridge from one day to the next. If my story can change how you see life, let it be this. Survival doesn't mean returning to normal. It means finding a way to love the self that the impossible leaves behind. It means giving yourself to the world, wounds and all, and discovering that in this radical honesty, you invite everyone else to do the same. This life, bruised and altered, can be more beautiful than you could have ever planned. I used to envy those who could breeze through life untouched by calamity, the kind of people who floated on rituals and routines and never questioned, never woke clutching their chest at 3 in the morning, never dreading the ring of the phone. But as I stepped further along the road of survival, my envy faded into something else. Gratitude, yes, but also a respect for those who have been forced to remake themselves, to patch together meaning out of fragments, to carry on loving the world even after it's broken their heart. As we celebrated 1 year since my brother's accident, we invited friends and family for a small gathering. No balloons, no speeches, just a meal under strings of soft lights on the patio. My mother, exhausted and proud, made her famous stew. My father, not a man of many words, squeezed my shoulder as if to say more than he ever could. My brother gave a small toast, hands shaking slightly, voice firm. To being here, that's enough. We all raised glasses. Most of us cried more from relief than from grief. That night, I understood it deeply. Surviving the impossible isn't something that ever fully leaves you. It becomes the undercurrent, a new key in the melody of your life, a vantage point that sharpens every joy and every sorrow. Work found me, or maybe I found work anew. I joined a small therapy collective as a peer support facilitator. My role wasn't to fix or to diagnose, but simply to listen, reflect, and share the insights forged in my own fire. Sometimes I wondered if I was helping, if all I had to offer were stories and scars. But then someone would say, "You're the first one I've heard who described it exactly like it feels." This, I learned, is the alchemy of compassion, transforming pain into solace, loneliness into solidarity. I continued in my volunteer work at the rehab center, but now added writing essays, poems, little pieces about what we'd all survived for small magazines and online communities. My words traveled farther than I ever expected. Emails came from strangers on other continents, readers who'd also survived car accidents, addiction, war, cancer, heartbreak, their stories braided with mine, a tapestry of resilience across borders and languages. Sometimes late at night, after reading a particularly raw letter, I'd feel again the enormity of what binds us. The simple, unassailable plea not just to survive, but to be witnessed, to matter. Through it all, I learned new boundaries. Surviving the impossible can sometimes make you prone to taking on other people's pain, being a rescue boat for every drowning swimmer. I learned, sometimes painfully, that I couldn't carry everyone. So I practiced saying, "I see you, I am with you, and now I need to rest." Rest became not just recovery, but resistance, proof that I valued myself enough to persist. My yes to others became more meaningful when paired with an honest, protective no. When people ask now, "What did you learn?" or "What would you say to someone in crisis?" I tell them this. First, let yourself feel everything. The pain, the fear, the anger that things will never be the same. Numbness isn't healing, it's delay. Then let yourself change. Let survival remake you. Don't force yourself back into a story that no longer fits. Find your allies, your companions, your safe harbor, and be that for someone else when you can. Forgive yourself for your limitations. Even heroes need sleep. Even survivors need to be held. The lessons of survival peeled away so many illusions. That life is fair, that tragedy has logic, that hard work always means reward, that being good is enough protection. In their place grew new convictions, that kindness is holy, that joy can be wrung from suffering, that we are made strong not by what we withstand, but by how courageously we allow ourselves to be changed. If I seem hopeful now, it's not because I believe tragedy will never return. I know it circles, always hungry, always ready. but I no longer live in fear of it. I live in reverence, awake to the sheer fragility and brilliance of breath, of mourning, of the people I love. Survival in the end didn't make me fearless, it gave me awe. One day, standing in my now flourishing balcony garden, my hands caked with dirt, my lungs full of spring, I watched my brother step outside, book in hand, for the first time since his accident. He sat on the tile, sun in his face, and I understood that we would both, always, be in the process of becoming. Not despite the impossible, but because of it. If my story changes how you see life, let it be in this: that survival is not a finish line, but a constant transforming force. And to believe fiercely in the gentle power of beginning over.